Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we unravel the business complexities at the intersection of environmental, social, and governance issues.
I'm Erica Schiller, and I'm joined by my ClimeCo colleagues, Emma Cox and Anna Stablum.
Get ready to explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership, the dynamic forces shaping our global economy.
From climate action to social responsibility, we're here to decode the ESG landscape by interviewing interesting leading figures across the globe that will empower you with actionable insights.
Whether you're a seasoned practitioner or just embarking on your sustainability journey, this podcast is your compass for navigating the future of responsible business practices.
Let's decode ESG together. So hello everyone and welcome to ESG Decoded. I'm your host for today's episode. I'm Anna Stablum and I'm based here in Singapore. And with me I have Mette Johansson from basically based in Dubai, but obviously with a background that we can go through in a few minutes. She's an amazing lady that I first met during an event organized by a group here in Singapore called Women in Mining and Resources. It was a one-day course that was about speaking at conferences and events and helping women and men who were also present to speak up clearly and to the point. Since then, Mette has written a book, amongst a lot of other things that she's been doing, of course, and it's called Narratives, so the stories that hold women back at work. This is, of course, a theme that is close to most women's hearts, and I'm very passionate about this. And I want to ask Mette today, why are we being held back? Why are we being paid less? Why is it harder for us to get a promotion? And we will also talk about why there are still so few women at the top of many companies. So why are the key roles, for example, like CEO and CFO, given to men? So these are some of the topics that we will explore in today's conversation. But first, if you don't mind, Mette, could you give the listeners a brief background about yourself and also why did you write this book?
Thank you very much, Anna. I was born in Denmark. I am Danish. I grew up in the Netherlands. I lived in Asia for 25 years, also 15 years in Singapore, where you're based. I'm right now based in Dubai. I do travel, especially Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific very much. I am a speaker. I am an author. I have done a lot of coaching and facilitation of meetings and training over the past 12 years since I left my corporate job. And today, what I focus a lot on is to align the vision with the strategy and culture in companies, as an advisor, as a consultant. Over the years, I've also ended up doing a lot of work in diversity and inclusion, not just because I am a woman, I am a speaker. And when you are a little bit visible out there as a woman, that's often when you get dragged into this gender equality conversation. And I'm very much driven by fairness. So when I see something that's unjust, unfair, I speak up about it.
That's great to hear. I can't help but think that it is really that fairness that sometimes it just feels so unfair, right? So you can't help but not speak up about it. And I see that you have your book in the background. I have the book here as well that I have read, which is lovely. But it actually means it's a book that makes you take notes and it's a book that's quite provocative, and it also you sit and you nod and you think, wow, that happened to me or that happened to my friend. And it's really something that I hope our listeners will get a chance also to read. But we can touch on a few of the topics in the book. And one thing that is really standing out, it is really about this. Why are only, I think the latest number is 15% now of all the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies run by women. So this is up from just 1% in 2002. Obviously, we're slightly better, but why is progress so slow? Why are we not seeing more women in those roles?
Absolutely. My book is full of these myths that are holding women back at work. And what I want to stress immediately, it is not just that it's women's fault. It's not just that it's the system's fault. It's definitely not just the men's fault. It is a complex problem that we need to address at different levels. That's the very first thing I want to say. It's not about man bashing. Sometimes these narratives that we're sharing, that we'll dive more into, it's also the women saying it. It is not just men saying things that are stereotypical of how women might behave. The women are saying it too.
Absolutely. I think it's a lack of awareness, right? And lack of being able to point and have words for also how we feel and how we act in the workplace. And I think what we will also talk a little bit about is, how we're raised. And I can't help but think sometimes I really feel as part of the problem. I catch myself saying things to girls that I would not necessarily say to boys. And I think it's bringing that awareness in everyday life is really the key point. But I wanted to go in and ask you, because you have been working with corporates, you have been talking to leaders and doing leadership courses. What is leadership, and why is that not necessarily aligned to how we women see ourselves? Why is it hard to kind of see yourself as a woman, as a CEO?
That's a great starting point, because yes, leadership is often defined in terms of how men have typically been leading over since the beginning of humanity. And a lot of women don't necessarily see themselves in that role of the leaders that they see today. That's why we need many more role models. That's also why we need to have DEI efforts to make sure that more women can be in very visible positions so that others can also see it to be it. We say you got to see it in order to be it. And that is true. We also need to change that concept of leadership. You said, what is leadership? Leadership is when you are inspiring somebody to follow you, when you are inspiring somebody to do something different. You are causing somebody to do something differently. It's not just, and in a lot of companies that I work with, it is reserved for the top leadership group. And that is dangerous. When we talk about leadership in terms of the executive leadership committee, and that is leadership, everybody else is a manager, then we're not striving enough to become leaders in terms of people leaders. And that we remain managers in terms of task managers. So yeah, what is leadership is where we need to start with. And a lot of the ways that we have defined what does a leader look like is defined in terms of what typically a man would much rather take on as a leadership characteristic than a woman would. So that's where we need to start to redefine what is leadership. I have a great example from a lunch that I had in Singapore some years ago, before I wrote the book, and the story is also in my book, that I had lunch with a female leader, Asia Pacific, for a large Fortune 500 company. We had a great conversation. And when I said, well, we need to start with measuring who are we hiring, who are we promoting? She dismissed me immediately and said, no, we've done lots of research around that. We've made sure that all our people processes are gender neutral. They are fair. I kept my quiet, and throughout the lunch at some point of time, she said, yeah, when I'm in the leadership team, I can tell that I'm bringing in different characteristics. I'm more patient, for instance. I then jumped in and said, all right, patience. So is that also reflected in who you're hiring, who you're promoting into leadership? That's when she said, you got me there, Mette.
I love it.
And that is because we don't know what we don't know. We are not enough aware of how we are promoting certain characteristics that are much more typically embodied by men than by women. It's going much deeper than simply doing a one-off study of, oh yeah, we've made everything fair, all our processes are fair. No, the more awareness we create, let's dive back into it again.
I like to hear that. And it's what I thought as well, which is something that you're also talking about in your book, is about bringing feelings to work, right? And bring passion, but that we bring different different types of passion or different feelings or different, maybe more the ways that we express these feelings. And I couldn't help when I read about aggression in men leaders, especially sitting on broken trading floors over the years, even in other areas. And even if you look around on the men actually that you have around you, aggression is a very typical male expression. And I couldn't help but when you compare in your book about, say, crying at work, but being super aggressive at work, one goes and one doesn't go. And one is actually tolerated, which I also thought was something that you touched upon in the qualities of leadership. It comes in not necessarily that you want aggressive leaders, but you want brave, you want risk takers, you want all those very male, or at least how we can often see these characteristics in men more so than women. And those are all tolerated, but crying or being really passionate and talking from the heart is not necessarily that accepted.
Absolutely. There was a Harvard Business Review article from about a decade ago or so, maybe a little bit more, that said that, don't show when you're too excited at work. So the advice that we give 10, 15 years ago to women was, if you're passionate, if you are excited, don't show these feelings at work because it's seen as unprofessional. Now, what kind of world is that where we can't show that we're enthusiastic, that we're proud, that we are happy, that we're passionate? That is crazy, especially explained by a chief human resource officer that I interviewed in India, who said, women too emotional at work, which is one of the narratives, the first one that I described in my book. She said, women too emotional at work. You should see the boys in the boardroom. When they don't get their way, they will slam their fist on the table, they will jump up, they will shout. And yes, as you're saying, it has become acceptable to show anger, to show aggression for men. And that is, of course, the more, shall we call it testosterone-driven feelings. And women may not show the feelings that may be more typical for women to show. Now, I'm not saying here that all women cry, all girls cry, and all men have lots of testosterone and aggression. Absolutely not. Of course, there's a very big zone of how we display feelings, what feelings we feel, and what feelings we display. The point here is also what is acceptable at the workplace. And it's acceptable for men to show anger. And by the way, it's not acceptable for women to show it. That's one of the things that also goes with this of women are too emotional. Well, if they get the same emotions that men can show, like anger, they are seen as, that angry woman for one little outburst. What Caroline Farberger says, a fellow Scandinavian, born a man, is today a woman. She says that the bandwidth of emotions that women can show at the workplace is so much narrower. And she was a leader as a man in the beginning, and then she transferred to being a woman. She's still a leader, but now a woman. And she says that there's a complete different bandwidth of behavior that women can display at the workplace.
It's interesting, isn't it? And you have heard about women leaders that basically the people around them are saying, but she behaves like a man. So that you I don't know, automatically, or that you start showing, that you start behaving, and maybe also because there's a lack of role models. So you start behaving as the leaders above you, and you take on some of those characteristics.
Yeah. First of all, we need to be careful about saying, she behaves like a man, because it's immediately seen as something negative. I prefer much more the wording that is maybe more competitive, maybe more collaborative. Instead of saying the male characteristics and the female characteristics, let's take the gender equation out of it, and let's describe that, all right, this person has more nurturing characteristics or more go-getter characteristics. Let's take gender out of it so that any gender can show up with any characteristics that they feel is their leadership strength. It goes back to, can you be the leader who you truly are? You'll be much more effective if the workplace allows you to be the leader that you truly are. That goes into the area of my next book, Authentic Leadership, which is very much also misunderstood. It's not about being nasty at work. If you feel like being nasty, that's not authenticity. It's leading with those values and characteristics that make you that amazing leader.
I like it. What I do find, though, and what has been interesting to see over the past, 20 years is actually female speakers at conferences and on stage. And just that has opened doors, at least for me, to kind of see, there are women leaders out there. There are women that have been promoted. And even just listening to, of course, younger women that are not necessarily at a higher level, but that their voices are being heard. And I love the shift that we are seeing at conferences. And now if you see a totally male-dominated panel, you actually react, right? And you start to think, that is not how it should be. 20 years ago when I entered the workplace, no one would have raised an eyebrow if there were only men sitting there. So there are obviously ways that we can help to get more role models out there. But how do we get them to really climb that kind of last ladder? And of course, some people are saying, women are not ambitious, and women might not want to be CEOs. Is that what it is?
It's very interesting. It's one of the myths that I describe in my book as well, about women are not interested in having a career, or mothers are not interested in having careers. In a Women in Leadership program that I've run for the past, almost a decade, I have one module that is about your big, audacious goal. I ask women who, by the way, have been picked by their bosses because their bosses see them as high potential. These women, I ask, what is your big, audacious goal? Some of them that will respond, in every single course I've had that, some of them will respond, I'm not really ambitious, I'm actually quite happy where I'm at. And they have difficulties writing down a big goal for their careers. The first time I heard this, I don't know where it came from, I spontaneously said, what would your goal be if you were a man? She picked up her pen and she started drafting her big, audacious goal. She got completely into the exercise, simply with that perspective change from I am a woman to, hey, I could be anything. I have, meanwhile, popped this question every single time somebody says, and it's in every single workshop that I do this big, audacious goal with women. Every single time I get I'm actually quite happy where I'm at, or I'm not so ambitious. Every single time when I say, what would your goal be when you're a man? They start dreaming much bigger. Then I ask, what was the change here? And they typically say, well, I'm already very busy as I am, because women are project managing the household as well. Even if they say, oh, my husband helps me, even that language of my husband helps me says that you have the overall responsibility and you might be delegating things. And if your husband doesn't pack the school bag of the kid that morning because he slept in, then you are still taking responsibility for it. You will still have all that thinking of pulling together all the strings to make it work harmoniously at home as well as at work. So it's either this having the responsibility at home in addition to a full-time job that's demanding, or it is also, I don't really want to be part of that politics that's going on with the boys. That's what I get very often as well, in a casual setting, of course, that they seem so much politics, backstabbing, and they don't want to be a part of that. And there's also a third category that's, I don't really see myself as a leader. And that gets back to what we said earlier, and you mentioned it again, you have to see it to be it. We have to have more role models speaking up on stage, so that we can see that women can take the lead, have things to say, have thought leadership. We need to have women in the boardroom, in top leadership positions in academia as well, in government, in diplomacy. We need to have women taking the lead everywhere with their natural characteristics so that a broader spectrum of leadership becomes acceptable and more women will see themselves as being leaders.
Yeah, I fully agree. And it's like you say, I have a friend who has been promoted twice, but she had to be actually, they had to convince her to take these jobs. And I think a lot of it comes down to confidence as well. And exactly what you're saying, of course, when we are taking, and you show those numbers in the book as well, how much time we are spending on home, unpaid work versus men. That number has not changed a lot over the years, which is also something that is just extremely sad, because you would think if you did then have more equal kind of call it opportunities at home, you would also have more equal opportunities at work, because you are taking on a lot of the burden from having children, and that's obviously one of the topics as well in your book, because having children, as we know, is a big thing that will also affect your pay, right? So you will always be after in your pay after having children, and that is of course weighing then on your entire career. And I had even, my mother in Sweden, she had a pharmacy, and she had a lot of her customers, pensioners, coming to the pharmacy as older women, and they actually had to pick one or two medications because they could not afford all of them. So this is something that goes with us from the day when you have those children, where you are being set back in your career and especially pay-wise, and then it's really hard for us to catch up. So I wanted to hear your views on that as well, because of course we all need to have more children. All of these societies that we're encountering, we're talking about, how do we get the population to have more children, but at the same time, as it's really negative, if you'd like, on a woman's career and her future pay. And that pay gap is just one of those things that really gets to me as well when we talk about this.
Your prime minister at some point of time, so the Swedish prime minister, if I may call the Swedish prime minister yours, Anna, the Swedish prime minister at some point of time when paternity leave was extended said equality starts in the home. And for my book, I also interviewed a Swedish, as they call them, still abroad, you will find it sometimes, the latte daddies. They think that, if you go on paternity leave, you have lots of time to take the stroller to a cafe and sit your latte with the other men, which is, of course, completely misguided. Anyway, I had an interview with a Swedish father who had taken paternity leave on the same level as his wife. And what he also says is that this is where it must start, because when you are having that bonding time, when the children are completely small, the mother goes out to work, the father is at home with a child, you have a bonding time that lasts throughout life, meaning that you're taking a complete different perspective. You want to be there for your children. You're learning to project manage the household as well yourself. So there will be much more equality if you start at that very early age by having not just maternity leave, but also paternity leave. Let's change it to parental leave. Now, there's one thing that I immediately want to say, and I experienced this when I lived in Germany, that if you take it too far, and I believe that Scandinavia is also having this as an issue, if you take the parental leave too far, give too much parental leave per child, then you end up the women still taking more of the parental leave and the women still earning less. And that is a vicious cycle, because it means that, well, the woman is earning less, so she better take the majority of the parental leave. In Scandinavia, we can split some of the parental leave between the two parents, regardless of gender. If the woman typically earns less, which women still do, you just mentioned the pay gap, then she typically will be the one who is taking the longer parental leave. And if you have 2 children, then she will have that twice. If you have even more children, she is the one who's suffering from setbacks at work, typically, because she will be away from the office longer. I had a friend in Germany where she was taking off 7 years from work, going back to the office after 7 years of a break. IT had completely changed. She had forgotten so much. She had a PhD, but she had to work on a very low level, way below her competencies, because she was missing 7 years of her career. So that's also what we need to have a look at. What Europe does is probably going a little bit too far. I do believe that it's great to have months together with your child when they are small. Let's not take years off. That is going to make the problem worse again. And that's probably why even some Scandinavian countries don't have that many CEOs for corporate entities that are women.
I agree with that. And I can't help but think exactly what you were saying, that the problem is, of course, that you start off with different pay in the beginning. So the decision of who is going to take most time off comes from that family decision. And in the UK, I had a lot of colleagues that when they had the first child, the woman was still working, but with 2 children, it no longer made sense for the woman to work because the daycare expense was basically similar to her salary. So she was the one then that went home. And oftentimes, exactly what you were saying, it's really even hard to get back into the workplace. So let alone coming back and then struggling to even just get a chance to actually re-enter the workplace is obviously a tricky thing. So what I loved about your book, and I want to talk a little bit about that, is obviously not a lot has happened, as we concluded. Quotas. A lot of people are discussing quotas back and forth. And in your book, you clearly state that you're pro quotas. Why is that?
Especially in the US, people like to say what gets measured gets done. Let's set some targets for what we want to have done so that we can talk about how can we achieve these targets. Now, I am not in favor of promoting somebody just because they have that profile. Absolutely not. I do believe in promoting somebody who will add value to that position. And we can get back to that meritocracy conversation in a little while as well. Now, is quota really the best solution of all? No, absolutely not. But if we don't have them, nothing tends to be done. Why? Because a lot of people that are already in the majority, they're comfortable in their positions. And of course, they have a personal incentive for maintaining status quo. On top, privilege is invisible to those who have it. The 2 of us have privilege. Absolutely, yes, we are women, so maybe we have a little bit less privilege than some of the men with similar backgrounds as us, Anna. Yet we are well educated, we are white. There is a lot of things about being straight, able-bodied, all of that. We come from a very prosperous part of the world. Scandinavians I have brownie points. When I go to northern Germany and I say that I'm from Scandinavia, I get brownie points. I don't know what it is. There's something magical about being Scandinavian in northern Germany. There's a lot of privilege that we have there. Now, when we have privilege, we're often saying, well, I was successful because I did a good job. Yeah. And there might be a lot of things that you are very lucky to have because people simply assumed also that you were good. I had a conversation we had some people over, friends of my husband's, a couple, and they were well into their 50s. At some point of time, he said, well, my father was a diplomat and he advised me to not go into diplomacy because they're only promoting women. So that's why I didn't go into diplomacy. And he said it in a way that he was very convinced that that was the best decision for him to not have gone into diplomacy because it would only have promoted women. Now, if he's well into his 50s, then his study decision, whether he was going to study political science or not, probably fell many decades ago. And that means that everybody who was in diplomacy then has already retired, right?
Yeah.
Because he's well into his 50s.
Yeah.
Now, I look up, just before this call, I looked up how many women study political science. It's fairly balanced with the genders. So that means that today we should have a balanced, at least, if not 70, 80% should be women today if they only had promoted women as diplomats, right?
You would
Wrong.
think.
The number has gone up from 20.5% of women in top diplomatic positions to 21% in 2024. He still is convinced to this day, well, I challenged him a bit in this conversation. I believe he still might be convinced to this day that it's the right thing that he didn't go into diplomacy because they would only have promoted women. Not. He would still have that privilege of us seeing leaders as more the male kind of leader. And that is why we are still having a lack of female leaders. We have this privilege that is invisible to those who have it unless we really step back and inform ourselves, and we need to do much more of that.
I do think that a lot of these men, and I see it in the mining industry here in Singapore, because the mining industry have really been trying to promote women, and some of the more ambitious companies have set a 50% target of having women. And you do hear, coming from a metals and mining background, that some of these, call it white privileged men, are complaining a little bit about these promotions, and they call it unicorns in some ways. And I don't know, maybe it's a natural thing that you feel threatened, that your position like you had and the way that you were, in contrast to your diplomatic friend or who never became a diplomat, that for many of these men, it was taken for granted that they would just be able to be promoted. And now with that factor in mind, that many of the HR decisions are taken, that, you know, we are trying to promote a bit more of a diverse workforce, it does feel like a threat. And maybe we have to understand that and maybe work with men in that regard to make them more positive about this change. And the same goes for quotas, I guess.
Absolutely. So with quotas, yes, I do believe in them, because otherwise nothing happens. We see that from the stories that we hear from all over the world. With the men who feel threatened, I can totally get that. I totally understand that. And if we are pushing women of a certain color, if we're pushing people when they're not capable of a job, that is, of course, something that a lot of people will feel uncomfortable about. Now, what we often see, though, is that we're not focusing enough on meritocracy. And the combination of, well, you see that people are promoted who have different traits than what you thought were leadership traits, it feels unfair. From what I see with most companies, it is not unfair when women are promoted. Now, let's have a look at that meritocracy as well. Typically, a woman may bring something else into the conversation compared to her male counterpart. Diversity increases group intelligence. Lots of studies have shown that, and that is because if you bring different experiences to the table, different viewpoints, different way of thinking, you get different ideas. And we are still in a knowledge economy, idea economy. Most of our companies that we work for, they also need to have innovation. So it's good for business to have creativity, to have innovation. That is what most modern companies are striving for. So that means we need to have that diversity of thought. So how are we going to make sure that we're bringing in that diversity of thought? By bringing in people who are different to us. So it is a must for a company. So how can we say that, oh, she's not good enough? Maybe you're looking at this one position, but she doesn't have mining experience. Well, maybe she has transferable skills that are very good to have diversity of thought also in a leadership team. That is what we need to be thinking about. Who's the best person, maybe not for that position, but for the company to bring in more diversity of thought. And by the way, back to when we are measuring what is a good leader based on male standards, then it will be much more difficult to get women promoted. And also, women, they will typically in an interview say, oh, but yeah, I don't know if I'm up to that task. Back to women underselling themselves, not seeing themselves as leaders. They might not even apply for a job because they're project managing at home. And then when they're at the interview, they might be underselling myself. A person I have very dear, she told me, yeah, she was at this job interview for a project management position. And she told the interviewer, if you're looking for somebody with 20 years of project management experience, that's not me. I just went, oh, please, why did you say that? Why didn't you say that at work, I've always been the one who's project managing all tasks, even if it was not in an official role. I have a certificate in project management. I know this company inside out. I'm ready for that position. A guy got it. He had project management experience. He had no experience in that bank. He failed. He left within his probationary period. That is typically what happens. So meritocracy is very difficult to measure. It's back to what are we measuring? Are we measuring what the male leader typically looks like? Then women don't have a chance. We need to have more diversity. That's one side of the point. That's better for companies. And when we're promoting women, are they really being the confident selves? Are they showing themselves, selling themselves in the interview? And by the way, there's also interviewer bias. When you're interviewing a woman, you are much more looking for, has she already done it, rather than for potential. Men are promoted for potential. Women are typically hired for experience. So there's all these things that play against women. So we do need to promote women a little bit faster than we promote men, and especially also women of color, because they have it even worse than we do, Anna.
Totally agree with that. And I can't help but think that it's really that kind of meritocracy. Meritocracy argument. Thank you. That is really key here, because I do think that it's not even fun for women when they feel like they're being promoted just for being women. So we need to have this argument across companies to say, yes, you are being promoted for your skill set, not because I hear a lot of women also, I don't want to be promoted just because I'm a woman. But I fully agree with you that if we can get the right framework and to really motivate women and to give them the skill set to go to these interviews, for example, which is something I know you're working with. What I wanted to just ask you is, with these programs that you have been working in corporates to try and promote women, to try and upskill women, to try and help women, for example, negotiate salaries, and what happens now when we have a US administration that is pulling back these kinds of programs? Do you think, are we going to see a step back? Just like with COVID, we had women really struggling during COVID, and now we are seeing yet another setback for women, especially in the US.
What I see as very dangerous when you're saying certain DEI activities are illegal, and instead it's focusing on meritocracy. And it's exactly that conversation that we just had that I see as being dangerous right now. That, well, if it was a true meritocracy, then I would agree with you. Yes, we need the best person for the job, not the best man for the job. That's unfortunately what we often end up doing. The best majority ethnicity, man for the job. That's often what we end up doing. If we could get to pure meritocracy, and meritocracy combined with who's the best person for the company, because we do need to have diversity. Where are we going to make that extra effort to get the diverse candidates? Absolutely, all of that needs to be also taken care of. So if we can get to that, then meritocracy is good. I believe right now a lot of companies are trying to find the way of how do they avoid lawsuits. It's going to be difficult, especially in the US, to get DEI right, because certain things are considered illegal, other things are, well, certain DEI things are considered illegal, but if there's discrimination, it's also illegal, right? So it depends on how lawyers and or judges are going to show up in court, whether you're going to be faced with a big lawsuit or not. And that is a huge danger. So what are we going to do to upskill women? What are we going to do to make sure that women have a fair opportunity? We still have to see how that works out. I do very much believe in taking women out and building their confidence before we put them back into an organization again. What do I mean? To take a group of women, put them in the room together and make them feel that their leadership style, their speaking style is absolutely okay. There are differences in how women and men typically lead, how women and men typically speak. Let's make it okay. Let's make women feel that it's okay to lead and to speak the way they naturally want to. But that needs to be done when we take the male factor out of the equation. That needs to be done in a group of women where women tell each other, wow, I loved how you were so passionate about this topic. So that women will continue to be enthusiastic and passionate about what they believe in and don't try to tone it down, because that is their leadership strength in many cases. So we do need to take women out, build their confidence in being great leaders, in having important things to say. How that's going to turn out, because it might seem as discriminatory when we do programs only for women, for instance. Now, I also want to get back to the point that you said about women don't want to be this token woman who are promoted just because they are a woman. I have been overlooked, dismissed, not given promotions for 2 decades because I was a woman. If somebody today gives me that board position on a listed company, now I'm being boards on a non-profit organizations. If I can make that step into a listed company, I'm certified in everything. If I can get that position just because I'm a woman, I'm going to take it.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to show you that I can do it. And even if I'm just not considered as anybody who's a serious candidate, I'm just put there, I will get that experience. I will work hard to prove my point that I'm worth it. And if they still don't accept that I'm worth it, that I'm very much adding value, then I'll go to the next board. I'll use it as a stepping stone and do it somewhere where somebody does value me. So make me a token woman.
Absolutely.
I'm in for it.
Here we go. I love it. That's great. This is what the attitude I think that we need as well, isn't it? Lastly, I wanted to, before we wrap up, I know you've been working in so many different places. You lived in lots of different countries. Is there a difference from culture to culture? Of course, we touched on where we come from and Scandinavia. But is there a difference out here, for example, in Singapore and the experiences that women are faced with?
In my experience, it's very much the same all over the world. The foundational challenges that women have, they're very much the same all over the world. The extent to how many opportunities women have are a little bit different from country to country, from industry to industry, individual to individual. Different companies, different bosses can be very challenging, right? Now, I have heard the same stories all over the world, whether it is in Scandinavia, where we are originally from, Anna. I hear the same challenges. Me Too has not gone far enough in Scandinavia either yet. I also hear about sexual harassment in Scandinavia still. India, we know about the gang rapes where women are considered less worth to the extent that you are allowed to gang rape. Of course, not all over India. There are pockets in India where this is considered okay, and she should just marry one of the guys who raped
Horrendous.
her. I live right now in the Middle East. I travel a lot to Saudi Arabia, where women couldn't drive a handful of years ago. I see everywhere that there are similar challenges, that women are being dismissed. And I also see that lots of initiatives are promoting women. There are these initiatives to make sure that we have that diversity when we're talking about corporate boards, executive teams, governments, academia, stages. As a public speaker, I need to point that out as well, that we have the diversity on speaking stages. I see many more initiatives happening. 30% by 2030. We have it here in the United Arab Emirates, where I'm calling from today. In Saudi, the leader MBS, he's also promoting a lot of women, a lot of leadership courses that I do in women. When I work with leadership teams, with boards, to align the vision, the strategy, and the culture, there's lots of women in the room, sometimes more women than men in my leadership development courses. Lots of initiatives happening everywhere, and women facing the same challenges, that they still have to project manage the house, so they don't have that full energy to go all the way in. They still are faced with, well, we see leaders as more a stereotypical man than a woman. We still have a pay gap. Lots of these challenges are absolutely the same all over the world.
Interesting. You did say in some of the chapters at the end of the book that the responses might be slightly different in different countries.
Yes. I have lived in Asia for 25 years. We're originally from countries that have a much more direct way of communicating. My husband is from Germany, where definitely you can criticize and you can give very direct feedback. You speak more negatively, I also find, than I naturally want to do. And that also means that conversations that you have will be very differently. For instance, I was in Perth just 10 days ago for a cultural intelligence training. It was a lot about diversity, inclusion, overcoming biases, especially with ethnicities and cultures. Now, a few women in the room, Australians, they said, if you see unfairness, you gotta call it out. You must say, this is not okay. This is the way you should be thinking. Absolutely okay. We were talking about a joke with sexual connotation. How do you react? Yes, in Australia, absolutely go ahead and say, this is not okay at the workplace.
Yeah.
Now, if you are in a different part of the world, now this by coincidence was also a Japanese company where you have a lot more harmony maintenance in a group conversation. You will not call it out like that. You will feel uncomfortable. People will feel uncomfortable. What do you want to achieve? You want to achieve that the world gets better, right? So in Japan, you would rather address it in a much softer way after the meeting. And in a lot of other places in the world, especially if you don't have the power to speak up, if you're lower in the hierarchy, for instance, if the culture doesn't have this strong speak up culture, another way of making sure that it is addressed is to ask a question. Would you say the same if she were a man, for instance? If somebody says, oh my goodness, she just was so emotional. How would you have described this situation if a man would have behaved in the same way? If a woman gets a little bit aggressive, what if a man would have expressed it like that? So ask a question. And of course, again, your tone very much makes a difference. If you simply ask a curious question of, I wonder, how would we have reacted if a man had slammed the fist on the table? That is a good way of calling into a conversation, making sure that you're pointing out something is not okay here. Really depends on where in the world you are, whether you're calling it in the moment, addressing it, whether you're calling it out, the extent of directness that you can use in such a situation. And by the way, the best thing is for somebody else to call it out, somebody who's not addressed. Like if somebody calls me an angry woman, and I get that all the time, yes, I do get a bit passionate and enthusiastic and emotional when somebody says, Mette, here you go again, you're being the angry woman. Yes, then I get the angry woman. I can promise you. So it's much better for somebody else who says, hang on, you're calling Mette an angry woman. What is the reason for that? I see her as being enthusiastic and standing up for her own opinion. If somebody else does that, that's so much more, it's much more effective. So let's have more bystanders who are witnessing that something is happening that's unfair, addressing it in a culturally appropriate manner.
Like it. Thank you so much, Mette. Thanks for joining the ESG Decoded podcast today. Thank you for sharing your passion, your enthusiasm for this topic that is so important to all of us here to really get that diverse workforce I think we will all benefit from. So I will let you go, and I thank you again for joining, and we hope to speak to you another time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Mette.
Thanks for tuning in to ESG Decoded. We hope this episode has inspired you to take action in your own ESG journey, stimulating ideas for partnership and innovation.
New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday morning. Subscribe now on your favorite streaming platform to stay in the loop.
Join the conversation on social media using @ESG Decoded or visit climbco.com for more resources.
Until next time, keep decoding, keep innovating, and keep making a positive impact.